The Kingdom of Scotland, a constituent member of the United Kingdom and a former member of the European Union. The Kingdom of Scotland is comprised of the mainland, the Inner Hebrides Islands, the Outer Hebrides, Orkney, and Shetland Islands. In the UK, about 84% of the people live in England, 8% live in Scotland, 5% live in Wales, and 3% live in Northern Ireland, rounding. In Scotland, 3 recognised languages exist: Plain English, Scots English, a language or dialect depending on who you ask, then Scots Gaelic, a more traditional language that's not directly related to the Germanic language family. I should clarify. English, Scots English and other languages like Frisian, or Norwegian are listed as members of the Germanic language. Scots Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Welsh and Brittonic are part of the Celtic language family. So, how did this happen? Disclaimer: everything about history is a mixture of speculation, logical assumptions, extrapolations and writing and drawing conclusions from artifacts. This is to say that, unless someone was there to witness it firsthand, we have to draw reasonable conclusions from what we have on it. I am also not an expert on Scottish history. Throughout this, I will be making jokes, so don't take it too seriously. Brief statement before I start: please like, comment and subscribe. It helps me make more stuff like this. Now back to your regularly scheduled programs. Now, a long time ago in a land that would be called Europe, a proto-Indo-European group traveled north from the Levantine region and through the Middle Eastern region. Roughly here, several major groups of interest split off. The Egyptians were a part of a much older group called the Afro-Asiatic family, which itself broke away from the Nostratic family prior to 6000 BCE. Of the groups, we care about the Indo-Europeans. This group broke away from its parent language, the Nostratic tongue, to form the Euro-Asiatic family around 6000 BCE in the Caucasus region. Side note: this is also around the time that the first wine was made. Some moved south and entered Anatolia while the rest moved north to the Eurasian steppe, around 4000 BCE. Around 3000 BCE, major linguistic differences began to appear, and the ancient forms of many European languages emerged, such as the Greeks, Slavics, Germanic, Celtics and others. In the Caucasus area, the Arya group emerged and eventually formed the Indo part of the Indo-European name. The Arya would eventually become the Iranian/Persians, Indians, Kurdish, and Medians. The Arya group would also be known as the Aryan, but rather than the blue-eyed blonde giants, they were the predecessors of the Indo-Iranian people. Now, just because the Indo-Europeans didn't arrive in Eastern Europe until the 3rd millennium BCE, doesn't mean that no one was living in Europe. Thanks to the remains of the Swanscombe skull, we know that an ancient species, once thought to be a part of the Homo erectus family, that Homo heidelbergensis lived in Kent from 600,000 BCE to 200,000 BCE. Homo heidelbergensis covered all of the Older World from the southernmost part of Africa to Jinnyush China, and Swanscombe Kent. In Afro-Eurasia, if there was an area where they couldn't walk, they did. The African branch eventually became the Homo sapiens while the others became Homo neanderthalensis, plus some currently unknown groups. But this wasn't until 200 to 100,000 years ago. Kinda hard to know who's who and we don't have evidence of them existing. Cornwall and Kent were the northernmost points of inhabitation as prior to 11,000 BCE, a thick glacial layer covered much of the northern lands. Though when the ice finally recessed enough, a land bridge still connected Britain and Ireland to Europe. The pre-Indo-Europeans lived and travelled along the land bridge currently known as Dogger Land, due to a Dogger shipwreck being discovered there. Like always, people are great at naming things. Fast forward to 6,200 to 6,100 years ago, A glacial remnant in Norwegian mountains fell into the water and was known as the Storge slide. This glacial slip involved a chunk of ice 290 kilometers, and 3,500 cubic kilometers of debris. The exact size is unknown, but estimates put the tidal wave as 20 to 25 meters tall and completely submerged Doggerland and flooded much of coastal Europe. So some water damage. Fast forwarding to the first millennium BCE, an Indo-European group called Celtics moved into Britain and Ireland. The exact fate of the original people is unknown, but there are two likely options: interbred with the Celtics or outbred. By the time of Caesar, all that was left on the islands were Celtic. Of the Celtic groups, three main families lived in the British Isles: the Brittonic family, British and Welsh; the Pictish family, traditional Scottish; and the Goidelic family, Irish and modern Scottish. With the Roman occupation of Britain and Caledonia, meant a Latin influence on the language. Even though the Picts live in the modern Scottish lands, they are not the direct ancestors of the Scots. In the Ulster region of Ireland, a Gaelic tribe that the Romans called the Scotti lived. Barely 2 steps into European history and we're already talking about the Romans and Caesar. Now as the Romans Romanized Britain, the Gaelic tribes fled to the outer regions of the island, Wales and Scotland for the most part. The Old British fled out of Middle and Central England, and moved into Wales and Cornwall. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the Romans may or may not have tried to settle. We don't have enough artifacts to say for certain. Roman items have been found there, but they might just be from trade. Also, a group of Gaelic speakers in the Ulster region sailed across and set up shop in the Hebrides area. This group was known as the Scotti, while the group in mainland Scotland was the Pictish. The Scotti spoke Old Irish along with mainland Ireland, while the Picts spoke Pictish, which alongside the Welsh and Brittonic was a part of the Brittonic Celtic family. Both the Irish and the Brittonic families were a part of the Insular Celtic family, as it was a name used to describe the native languages of the British Isles. By the 6th century, most Brittonic speakers were living in the western regions of the island, having been supplanted by the Angles of southern Denmark and northern Germany, Saxons of coastal West Germany, Frisians of the Netherlands, and Jutes of northern Denmark. Though people only really remember the Angles and Saxons. Now the Brittonic were not just in Britain, as they had set sail to escape the influx of Germanics and settled in Brittany as well was Bretona and Galicia. This is actually why Britain is called Great Britain in many languages, to differentiate between Britain and Brittany, and to a lesser degree Bretona. Spanish say Gran Bretona for Great Britain. German says Großbritannien and Bretagne. And French says Grande Bretagne in that funny-speaking French province. I joke, but each region in France seems to dislike each other, but they all agree that Parisians suck. But with the introduction of the Anglo-Saxons, Britain started becoming English or English. But back to Scotland. By the late 700s, the Scotti inhabited the Argyll area and Ulster, and still spoke Old Irish at the time. But what's that? Look, it's the Vikings. Yeah, that's right, as the 700s became the 800s, Viking raiders from Scandinavia arrived in the British Isles and settled the lands. Shetland, Orkney and the Hebrides were settled along with the northern coasts of Strathclyde by the Norwegians. Denmark mostly focused on England while Norway mostly focused on Scotland and Ireland. Side note, Shetland and Orkney had a unique island language called Northern that went extinct around 1850, but has seen a revival in the language like the Cornish or Manx language. Now with the Norse Vikings settling areas like Dublin, Manx and the Argyll area, while the Danes settled the Danelaw region, this meant that there would be a linguistic influence. Later that century, in 843 CE, Kenneth I MacAlpin, king of Dalriada, joined the crowns of Dalriada, and the Picts through the right of his unknown mother, sister to Constantine MacFergus, to form the kingdom of Alba. We know who his aunt was, but not his mom. History is weird, folks. Now, Kenneth I was the first king of the new kingdom of Alba, and reigned until 858 CE. He is best known for having much of the mountainous, Scottish lands of Dalriada seized by the Vikings. This likely drove him to invade the Pictish kingdom and claim its throne. The loss of Dalriada and the Hebrides was of little loss as the land was mountainous and largely infertile. Important side note: just because some Cowpen king ruled an area, it doesn't mean that they controlled it. They were a feudal kingdom and, as such, the royal family owned an amount of clan land, while the lords of the other clans swore loyalty to the family. The Alban kings also didn't have a succession law, so it was dependent on who had the largest army or who made the best case to the clan lords. Now Kenneth I passed away from what was likely a tumor around the 13th of February 858 CE. His brother, Donald I, succeeded him until he passed on the 13th of April, 862 CE. His successor was Constantine Maxinada, son of Kenneth I. Yep, it just skipped Donald's kids for whatever reason. Constantine I reigned until 877 when he died defending against Viking incursions. Then his brother, Auld Maxinada, ruled for a year before he was killed by associates. Likely his nephew Garrick. His uncle's son Garrick mac Dungale possibly ruled with Ar against the Briton king, Ochid of Strathclyde. This is a hazy period as the writings are written well after or are biased in some way. The throne ping-ponged quite a bit, skipping past all the crazy. For simplicity's sake, the Vikings' invasion led to the Scots and Picts joining together to stop the invasion, like the Wessex and other English kingdoms did. Jumping to 1034, Malcolm II of the House of Alpin, made the wise choice of dying with no heir, but he did have a daughter. So the crown would skip her completely because no girls were allowed, and land on the head of her son Duncan I, the diseased Mac Crianan, the guy that Shakespeare based the Scottish play after. The story is not 100% accurate, so heads up. Like the play, Macbeth replaced him, but it didn't work out as Shakespeare wrote. Macbeth, or as it was in Scottish, Macbethad, was the king or earl, officially the Mormont, of Moray. Duncan I invaded Moray and was killed by Macbeth's army. He was king of Alba for 17 peaceful years and was succeeded in his death by his stepson Lulach the Unfortunate. He reigned from September 1057 to March 1058 when Donald's son, Malcolm III's army killed the 25-year-old king. Side note: by 1066, the Vikings landed in Yorkshire and on the 25th of September became the inspiration for a song known as Ved Stanford Bua, which was a battle that saw King Harold Hardrada of Norway fight against King Harold Godwinson of Wessex's army at Stamford Bridge. Hardrada's forces lost because the Wessex army attacked at night and stabbed the defender of the bridge and the crown jewels. Afterwards Godwinson had to rapidly march south to Hastings where William the Bastard of Normandy's army met him. Godwinson died from an arrow to the eye and William of Normandy took the throne of England. So, for those keeping track, the Celtic arrived in Britain and supplanted the older inhabitants, and they were supplanted by the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, who themselves were supplanted by the French Nordic Normans of France. Scotland just had the Picts joining, being assimilated, by the Scots. Now Malcolm III was best known for establishing a solid base for his dynasty, which withstood prodding from the Norse of the Mountain Islands and the Anglo-Normans of England. Quick facts to add: Lothian and Strathclyde were added to the Kingdom of Scotland in 1124, confirmed in the 1137 Treaty of York. Galloway in 1234/1235, because Lord Alan Fitzroland died without a legitimate son. The community of the area supported the bastard Thomas of Galloway, and King Alexander III of Scotland supported the daughters, so he invaded and the land was divided between the three. which basically meant that the Lordship of Galloway was incorporated into the Kingdom of Scotland as no male rulers remained. The Norwegian and Scottish are in a sort of Cold War for the past few centuries. While the Scots controlled the mainland, the Norwegians controlled the Western Islands, Shetland, Orkney, and the Inner and Outer Hebrides, including Manx. This meant that all trade through the west coast was controlled by the Norwegians. By 1266, the new King Magnus IV of Norway, of the Hardrada dynasty, and Alexander III of Scotland signed the Treaty of Perth to put the war on hold, because the last Norwegian king was murdered on Orkney. But at least it meant that the Scots would be able to buy the Hebrides and Manx for 4,000 mark coins, plus a yearly addition of 100 marks for continued dominion. This also saw the Norwegian acknowledgement of disputed territory and Scottish recognition of the Norwegian rule over Orkney and Shetland. Later that century, in 1296, the First War of Scottish Independence began with the English attempting to dominate Scotland. This is because Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, influenced the Scottish voting council to choose an English-backed King of Scotland after Alexander III died, with his male heir dying at 7, so Queen Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was acting regent. This led to the Great Pause where 13 claimants attempted to be king. Most notable of them are John Balliol, Robert de Bruce, grandfather of Robert the Bruce, John Hastings, and Count of Holland, Floris v. because why not? John Balliol was chosen as King of Scotland in 1292 after, the often disputed title, Queen Margaret passed away, taking the throne of Scone. This was thanks to a strong English pressure on the council to get him chosen. With his quote-unquote rule, saw a strong English influence in which Scotland was treated as a vassal because they needed him to choose the Scottish king. Oddly enough, the Scots didn't like being treated poorly in their homeland, shocker I know, so they took control and installed the Council of 12. In 1295, King John signed the Auld Alliance with France. This means the Auld Alliance as the two were united in their dislike of the English for a decent amount of time. The defensive alliance was invoked in the case that either was invaded by the English, then the other would invade England in turn. It was informally dissolved in the Treaty of Edinburgh, in 1560. England invaded because of the Auld Alliance. The First Scottish Independence War was a part of the larger Anglo-French War of 1294 to 1298, and the subsequent War of 1300 to 1303. With the war, also saw King John of Scotland abdicate after the English capture of Dunbar Castle. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London until 1299, when he was sent to France and released into the custody of Pope Boniface VIII, on the condition that he remains at a papal residence. His capture also saw the English seizure of the seal of the Kingdom of Scotland and the royal gold crown. Edward ordered the crown be offered to the St. Thomas Shrine of Canterbury. The seal though, he just kept it. That's an important relic that the English crown stole. The First Scottish War of Independence is also the war in which William Wallace served. He was appointed the Guardian of Scotland until the Battle of Falkirk. The Scottish forces were outnumbered 30,000 to 12,000. The English were led by King Edward I, while the Scots were led by Macduff of Fife, Sir John Graham, Sir John Stewart, and William Wallace. Both suffered 2,000 casualties, but Stewart, Graham and Macduff were killed in action. This defeat saw Wallace step down as Guardian of Scotland from the failure. Side note, by 1302, John Balliol made no attempt to contact the Scottish and they were left with no king. The English rubbed salt into the wound by stealing the Scone Stone, an important Scottish relic from the first kings of Alba. Another important relic was stolen from its homeland and taken by the British. Here's hoping this doesn't become a trend. Wallace continued to serve in a military position until he was captured near Robertson by Edward I and his army. He was charged with high treason against English civilians, probably because Edward was a dick. Wallace was hung almost to death, drawn by a horse, emasculated, eviscerated, beheaded and quartered. The next year would see Wallace's successor as Commander-in-Chief, Robert the Bruce, take the throne as Robert I. He was briefly excommunicated by Pope Clement V because he killed John Comyn, the main rival for the throne, but Bishop of Glasgow Robert Wishart excommunicated him. As king, he led several successful campaigns against the British, ranging from traditional battles to guerrilla attacks. 1308 saw the throne pass from Edward I to his fourth of 10 children, Edward II. Real creative name I know. He got the throne because his older brother John died in 1271, and his other older brother Alfonso died in 1273, then Henry died in 1274, still by process of elimination, the fourth son of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile. Edward of Glenarvan became the heir apparent. His mother would die in 1290, and his father would marry Margaret of France and give him 2 half-brothers before his father's death in 1307. He was crowned king in 1308 and chose to continue his father's war. 1309 saw Robert I hold a Scottish Parliament, which was a clear declaration of independence against British rule. Edward would agree to a 13-year truce. The war would outlive Edward II as he was killed in 1327, leaving the war and crown to his son Edward of Windsor. Or so he would think, because Isabella, the she-wolf of France, would kill Edward II and take over as regent with her lover Roger Mortimer as her son Edward was still a child. Despite Edward III becoming king in 1327, aged 14. His mother and her lover would be the de facto rulers until 1330, when he would lead a coup d'état and reclaim his throne. Isabella would sign the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, which would recognize the independence of Scotland with Robert I as its king. That ended the First Scottish War of Independence. Good timing too, as Robert would die the next year, leaving the 4-year-old King David II as king in June. 2 months later, Edward Balliol, the disinherited, led an army to take back his father's throne. That was short. But what was even shorter was Edward Balliol's time as king. He defeated the boy king's army, and took the throne. Because, I don't know about you, but a 4-year-old shouldn't win against an adult male in a fight. Despite having the advantage of being an adult, the loyalists of David II kicked Edward B. out of Scotland. Apparently, the historians felt it was important to say that Edward B fled to England, on a horse, naked. While this may be taken literally as to say that he fled in a buff, I believe that it was a metaphor to say that he fled without an army or wealth. Whatever was the situation, in 1333, Edward Balliol and Edward III led a combined army to retake Scotland. The Loyalists defended as best as they could, but was forced to flee to France as Philip VI offered sanctuary. The English didn't like this and decided to cause a scene. More accurately, they started the 100 Years' War, which lasts from 1337, to 1453. That's right, 116 years, 5 generations and numerous truces that were immediately broken. This happened because Edward III claimed the throne of France, due to his uncle Charles IV of France dying without a son, and his daughter, the Duchess of Orléans, Blanche Capet, had no children. This was the end of the main family of the Capet. Edward of England claimed the throne as his mother was the sister of Charles IV, meaning that he was the closest male relative. Yet the French chose Philip VI of the House of Valois. His relationship with the former king was having Philip III, from 1270, as their common ancestor, compared to Edward and Charles sharing Philip V. 1341, the 17-year-old David II reclaimed his throne while Edward Balliol moved to England. In 1346, the 23-year-old king led an army into northern England and was captured by the Archbishop of York's quickly thrown together army. Out! David was imprisoned in the Tower of London and, again Edward Balliol tried to retake the throne. You know, after the third time of losing the throne, I'd just throw in the towel. In 1348, the Black Death hit the island and devastated the economy. Won't anyone think of the economy? After 10 years, Edward threw in the towel, abdicating and dying without a child in 1367. The English decided to ransom King David II of Scotland in 1357 for 100,000 silver merk coins, supposed to be around £16 million adjusting to roughly 2022. With the plague and this large sum, this devastated the economy further. David attempted to negotiate that he would relinquish the throne, in the case he died with no child, to Edward III in exchange for forgiving of the debt. The Scottish Parliament rejected and continued to pay. In 1371, upon the death of David II, he was succeeded by Robert II of the House of Stewart, grandson of Robert the Bruce, through his daughter Marjorie Bruce and her husband Walter Stewart. The Stewart clan is sometimes spelt Stewart with a U and Stewart with a W. The W spelling was the one mostly used by Scottish kings until Mary, Queen of Scots, chose to use the French spelling with a U. Queen Mary's husband Henry Stewart, Lord of Darnley, chose to use this spelling instead of his father Matthew Stewart's spelling using the traditional W, and thus all English monarchs of the Stewart house use this spelling. When Edward III died in 1377, the outstanding debt was buried with him. At least the English did one nice thing for the Scots. Looking at the remainder of the script, I really need to break this into two parts, otherwise this would be very time-consuming. So, I've been the Irish Explainer. I also set up a Patreon, link in the description. If you want to influence what topic I'll cover next or want access to my scribbles, please go and check out. Thanks for listening! And this has been a brief rundown on Scotland and its history from the first to live in the land until the late 1900s. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to place them in the comments below. How did I do and what can I improve on? Let me know what I should cover next. Have a great day and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.